Hey there, welcome back. It's Ingrid. Today we're going to play with a little bit of watercolor and create some snowy scenes. You can create some artwork or make some holiday cards like I did. First off, I'm taping down some cold press watercolor paper. You can see I've got a variety of brushes. All the materials are listed below. Choosing my colors and swatching them out to make sure that it's exactly what I'm looking for before diving right in. I'm honored to be one of the participants in a really fun video hop for my good friend Ardith to celebrate her milestone on her YouTube channel. And we've got some great prizes thanks to our sponsors. Be sure to leave comments all along the hop. All the instructions and details are in the section below along with all the supplies. You can see here that I took a very light wash, super light blue wash, and created a little bit of a wet area in order to do a little bit of wet on wet technique here. I added a little bit more of darker blue. It was a little more than I wanted. I'm trying to create a snow bank or a snow drift here. Just something subtle that sits behind the trees, the impression of, some depth in snow that you might see, maybe in the distance or directly behind. And you can see I added a little bit more there to the bottom. I was kind of really loving what happened there on the other project on the left, and that project is going to be a little later. Now we're just adding some light shadow trees. I added 3 just kind of for backdrop and to give me a guide, as well as some trunks here with some of the brown, and starting to layer using this kind of bluish green color here, just real light shadow. And this is going to be an undercolor behind a brighter green, and then we're going to layer a deeper olive green on top. So we have a little bit of variety, a little bit of depth, dark and light on our tree, and this is really going to help with details and give it a much more realistic feel. And it's really funny because paintings, they go through such phases. It's in a major ugly duckling phase right now. But you have to trust me, the end result is very cool. Now next up, we're adding a little bit of depth to our project with some perspective. The tree that's in the foreground, that one obviously is going to be a little bit more close to us if we were standing right there in the scene, so thus it's going to be much taller. And that helps give a little bit more of a realistic feel to your watercolor. Here we're adding the details, and this is the olive green. And you can see just adding some real small strokes. This is a smaller round brush with a really fine tip. You want to make sure to have good brushes. Good brushes are important in that the tips stay nice and pointed, as well as the water load that they hold and paint load. It makes painting so much easier, and you have a much better experience. So if you're finding that you're a little frustrated when you're actually watercoloring, I challenge you to perhaps take a look at the supplies that you're using. I have everything linked below to some brushes that they don't break the bank, but they will make your experience much more fun. Next up, we're continuing to add detail to our trees that we have here. And if you really would love to just follow along in real time and see real-time projects, be sure to check out my Patreon channel. It's linked in the description area below. There I post real-time tutorials for a lot of the things that you see over here on YouTube, as well as some exclusive projects. It's a great little community, and we'd love to have you over there. So you can see here now just adding a little bit of shadow, again using that super light blue just to give it a little bit more depth. Gonna give it a super quick zap and then allow this to dry naturally before moving on to the project on the left. But right before we do that, we want to add some finishing touches to really make this card, although it would be beautiful just as it is, I have to add snow. I can't not. I love snowy scenes. Now this brush that I'm using ended up being a little too big, so you can see here that I moved to a much smaller brush. This is actually a 1 round, and it's important to have at least 1 or 2 really fine detail brushes because they really do help when you need to add small little details. I'll even move to a 0 in a second for some smaller details. I'm using white gouache, permanent white gouache, which will layer on top. It's more of an opaque paint, and that's really great for snow. You can see here I'm adding, coming back in with some of the olive green with a 0 brush, and this helps just give a little bit more realistic look to the snow, because the snow isn't just gauby, it doesn't just plop onto the tree. I mean, sometimes it does, but in this instance, you can see that it's kind of just either falling or has already melted a little bit, so that adds a little bit to it. Using a very, very stiff, inexpensive brush there and a watered down gouache with just gouache and a little bit of water there to flick some snow, real fine snow, onto my project here. And then we're going to add some larger, snowflakes using, again, that small brush just to create some little dots so that it has a little bit of variety, giving the sense that that snowfall is really right close up. And look at the detail. Can you see all the little details and how using the multicolors gives it a little bit more depth? It's such a beautiful card. I know you will absolutely love recreating it. So for this background, we're going to take a 1-inch flat brush and just really get a nice coating of water here. Allow that to kind of soak into the paper before adding some color. You want to make sure that it's wet so that we're working the wet on wet technique here. Starting off with a lighter gray wash, I'm using Payne's Gray with a little bit of blue into it, and then just adding some more color and just building up the intensity of the color there on the edges. I want to have a nice gradual wash of color going down, and this is really for the background. It's meant to be very light and it's going to dry a lot lighter. Taking away a little bit of that excess water there on the edge, being careful not to remove any of the color there, and then really allowing that to properly dry. I was going back and forth between the two projects. While one was drying, I was working on the other one, so that's why you see them in each other's videos. Adding another light layer of gray, and now we're starting to add the back trees. So these would be the trees that are in the distance. It's actually a blue, but it's a kind of like a bluish gray color here, and really, really light. The further back the trees are, the lighter they should be in value. So because they're further in the distance, so you're not seeing them as strongly. And then the closer up, you'll see the trees get bluer and bluer, with the absolute foremost foreground layer being indigo. Now, when you're adding this and you've adding more and more water, you want to make sure that those layers are dried in between. And I did that. I would create a gray background, dry it, then add a little bit of more blue to the trees the further forward I would go. And then as things dried, I needed to adjust them as well. So that's why you see some more gray trees being laid down afterward, because as they dried, they were just a little too light and I wanted them to stand out a little bit more. So you'll just have to kind of play with it and see how it feels. But it is important to allow those layers to dry, because if they don't, then they will continue to bleed into each other and you will really kind of destroy what you have going on there underneath. I also have a real-time version of this particular project in my Patreon community as well. So if you want to paint along and see something completely real-time, definitely check that out. The link is in the description below, along with all the supplies, the colors, everything that I used for these two projects. So now that we've kind of got this gray layer and it's dried to my satisfaction, we're now going to start to layer some of the trees that are a little bit closer into the viewer. So this layer right here is blue, but this is not the darkest blue. You can see I laid down some newer blues onto my China palette that I have going on over there, and it's just an inexpensive plate I bought. Actually, I was in Germany at the time, but I just bought in a store. It's nice and flat, but it's a nice surface. So you can see I'm just kind of just creating some very random trees. They're loose in nature. Just didn't want them to be, I didn't want to have to stress out over creating the most perfect tree. This project is really more about creating a snowy forest and just creating some nice loose watercolor, layering a little bit more darker detail on top, maybe extending a few before moving on to the foreground. You don't necessarily have to worry about the bottom at this point, because that's going to be with the darkest color. Layering in a little bit more darker gray. You know, the further and further that dries and the more you start to add those trees in the forefront, it's totally okay to go back in and add a little bit more of the shadow layers from behind. And part of why it's very this is a very flexible project is you are doing it in layers. And since you're going to add a darker layer in the front that extends over some of those trees, you don't need to worry so much about the perfect transition between the layers. It can be a little messy, and that makes this a really fun project because it's the imperfection of it that makes it a joy to paint. So now we're starting off with the indigo layer, and we're just going to create, and you can see I'm really taking my time here and just creating like a really nice tree here on the edge. And when you're working on the edge too, if it's easier for you, move your brush off to the other side if it's odd to create just half a tree. You know, you can absolutely do that. I'm using some paints by Kuretake. It's the Gonzai Tombi paints. I have the 36 pan set, and it's a great, you know, relatively inexpensive set. It's pretty decent quality. You know, it's not like my artist level Schminke paints. They're a little, I find them not to be as translucent, but they are a real dream to work with. They have really great vibrant colors. They blend really easily. So I really do enjoy it. So if you're just really getting into watercolor and you don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on some really amazing paints, that's okay. A set like this is perfect. And it has a really nice variety. So there you can see I've really built up some really fun layers, and now I'm going to come back in and add a little more detail to some of those trees and just kind of, you know, if something's missing somewhere, pop a little something in there. But you can see how those are in the front. So those are the tallest, they're the darkest. Here you can see a little more detail going back down, and I'm coming in directly into the pan of paint versus onto my palette for the most intense color to layer on top. And when you're doing detail, I definitely encourage you to go directly into your paints versus a wash that you created on your palette so that you have that real intense color. So now that we're finishing up with the final touches here, we're going to add just some little details. You know, this is the point in the project where, you know, maybe I needed a little tweak somewhere in the background. So that's what I'm doing. I felt there wasn't enough of a farther away layer. So adding a really, really light, super light gray layer in the back. And you know, it's funny, you don't want to overdo things, and I was kind of feeling like I was starting to overwork it a little bit, so I needed to stop myself. But I did need that final layer in the distance. Using some artist gouache here, some white gouache, and a very, very firm bristle brush. Again, like the first project, if you didn't see that. Just basically dipped my brush in water. I didn't spray my gouache, and that is enough water to make that a little bit more fluid. And we're just going to do some flicking. You can see gently just moving my finger along that side. I'm sorry, my other camera, the battery had died, so I don't have the side angle, which I really would have liked for this. But I think I just gave you a good idea of how I do this. This is real speed right at this moment, just so you get an idea of how fast I'm going. And then we're just going to kind of jump forward. I did several layers. There's actually a lot of snow on this one, but it was all very fine. So I decided to come back in with my 0 brush, or actually this is, I think, a 1, and just came in with the smallest of little dots just on here because I wanted a little bit larger snowfall, especially over the indigo layer, to give you that illusion that you're standing right there again. Again, it's perspective. You know, you have lots of little snowfall, you know, further out in the distance, but up close, you want to have that larger size for the more realistic look. And you can really see that here. You can see the detail on the trees, that darker indigo that was dropped on top, and again, it's the layers that create the magic and those large snowflakes as well. So thanks again, Ardith, for letting me play along with everybody today, and be sure to leave comments in the section below. There's lots of prizes. Don't forget to click the next person in the hop. The link is in the description below, and to see even more cool techniques, click that video right to the left, and I'll see you right there.